112 Ocean Avenue, the home of a gruesome scene where Ronald DeFeo Jr. took the lives of his entire family. And thus, the story of the Amityville Horror House was born. But did you know that William Weber, who was the defense lawyer for DeFeo Jr., met with the owners, George and Kathy Lutz, and over a bottle of wine, they concocted the whole story to sell in a book? The Amityville House is famous for being one of the most haunted places in America. It has had a significant impact on horror cinema over the years, and further cemented the validity of paranormal investigations. But was there any truth to this haunting, or was it just a hoax? Some of the people involved in the story have admitted that it was a hoax, whereas others swear the house is haunted. So, why is everyone's account different? What is the true history of the house? And what do the surviving children have to say about the hauntings? And before we dive into all this, let me know, what do you think happened? What is your opinion about Amityville? Go ahead and post in the comments. Let me know. So the first question that you might be asking yourself is, why did the Amityville haunting become such a believable story back then? Well, the reason that people did believe that the house was haunted and that there was bad stuff there was because of what took place in the house before the Lutzes moved in. The Lutzes are the people whose account of the haunting created the book. So let's discuss the family that was there before the Lutz. It was a cool fall night around 6:30 p.m. when Ronald DeFeo Jr. ran into Henry's bar panicking. He was yelling that his family was shot. The small group of people that were at the bar followed back to his home at 112 Ocean Avenue. And one of the men found the bodies of the parents and then called emergency services. Jr. took the lives of his parents, Ronald DeFeo Sr., 43, Louise DeFeo, 43, and his four siblings, Don, 18, Allison, 13, Mark, 12, and John, who was 9. All the victims were shot with a .35 caliber rifle around 3 a.m. earlier that day. Jr. then took a bath, went to work, and he quote-unquote found his family after work and ran to the bar. I guess and this was his attempt to try to take suspicion away from him. The children were found with single shots while the parents received 2 shots each. Physical evidence suggests that the mother, Louise, and daughter, Allison, were awake at the time of the attack. However, all the victims were found lying face down in their beds. DeFeo Jr. convinced the police on scene that it was a mob hit, so they took him to the station for his protection. Once at the station, the detectives spoke more with Jr., and they started noticing inconsistencies in his story. The detectives had Jr. come in the next day so they could interrogate him as a main suspect. This led to Jr. confessing to the and leading them to where he ditched the evidence. A famous quote from this confession is, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." Trial began on October 14, 1975. William Weber, his lawyer, presented a defense of insanity, claiming that he had no memory of the Now, remember the name William Weber, the lawyer. He comes back into play later on in this story. Now, this would be one of many stories that DeFeo gave of what happened that night. He tended to change his story quite a bit, never really knowing the truth. Like, no one ever really found out the truth because he just gave different accounts of different stories all the time. And it was constantly just a lot of misdirection on his part. We will take a look at all the versions of his story as well shortly here. Now, back to the trial. The jury actually never bought this plea of insanity. It just didn't work out. The jury wasn't convinced. So on November 21st, 1975, the jury found DeFeo guilty on 6 counts of second degree M-word. I know YouTube doesn't like us using certain terms, so I'm probably going to have to bleep out a lot of things. And on December 4th, 1975, Judge Stark sentenced to 6 counts of life in prison, so 25 life in prison. Now, due to the way that DeFeo kept changing his story and some of the other things that came up during the investigation, there's a lot of controversies and inconsistencies, and those were kind of leveraged a bit to further prove of a possible haunting or demonic thing inside the house. So let's just discuss a few of the inconsistencies and controversies regarding the case. So some of these became a key aspect for the argument of Jr. being possessed and the house being haunted. First up, we have the motive. Why did he do it? A lot of people try to point out that the motive remains unclear. They try to suggest that he was possessed and that's why the motive is not obvious. However, Junior had a tense relationship with his father. A number of non-supernatural motives have been speculated. Junior did ask the police how he could collect his father's life insurance money when they were interrogating him. Additionally, Junior was an addict, so his motive could have just been fueled by wanting money for another hit. There may have been family tensions that also existed because in the 70s, a lot of families still were pretty insulated about sharing what's going on behind closed doors. A lot of people were trying to put a good face to the public. So it's kind of the way things were back then. And he did also get arrested. He was on probation for stealing a motor. So like they have this son who's been arrested. He is an addict and different things like that. So I'm sure there was major tension inside the house and that could have been enough. It could have been a fight. It could have been over the money, over life insurance. It could have been any of those things. But that seems more believable than a demon took over his body, in my opinion anyway. All right, the next controversy or inconsistency is regarding the crime scene. So the odd thing about the crime scene is that every person was in their bed and they were all lying face down. They were all shot and the gun did not have a suppressor. Junior said that he drugged the family, but no sedatives or drugs were found in the toxicology. Some people have turned this aspect of the case as a sign of something supernatural. But if we go back to his quote that he said to the police officers, he said everything was happening so fast and he couldn't stop once he got started. So I think he just did it very fast. Now, there is a possibility that he placed them all face down because that's like a guilty conscience thing. A lot of people don't like to see the faces of the people that they've hurt. So like it's possible that he did that and people are just kind of blowing it into something that it really isn't supernatural. The next controversy that people talk about is just DeFeo's different accounts of what happened. Some people try to use this as a way to explain that a demon may have been controlling him and that's why he doesn't remember things properly. So let's talk a little bit about his different accounts. Junior said in one of the accounts that Dawn, who was his sister, took out the father, and then his mother was so grief-stricken by this that his mother then took everyone else out. That was one account. Another account, his sister Dawn again organized it all with an accomplice. He, Junior, walked in, tried to take the weapon away from her, and shot her by accident during the struggle. This account he tries to back up with the evidence showing gunpowder residue on Dawn's nightgown. However, it was unburned gunpowder, and a ballistics expert at the trial explained unburned powder comes from the muzzle. So all that means is that she was close to the muzzle when it happened. It doesn't mean that she was actually pulling the trigger. It means she was on the other side of the weapon. But for some time, he did try to spin this and tried to use this as evidence. He even mentioned it during an A&E documentary as well to further substantiate his claim that she's the one who did the crime. Our next account takes place on November 30th in the year 2000. Junior met with Rick Osuna, the author of The Night That DeFeos Died, which was published in 2002. He told people that they never actually spoke and that he gave no information for the book. Osuna says that they spoke for 6 hours. The account Junior gave Osuna is he had committed the crime with Dawn and 2 friends, Augie DeGennaro and Bobby Kelski. And they did this out of desperation because his parents had plotted to take him out instead. He said that his sister Dawn took out the children so there were no witnesses. Then he got mad about this, which led to the struggle over the gun and caused him to accidentally shoot his sister. Now, with this story, the medical examiner also did point out that there were no other wounds or signs of struggle on Dawn's body, so the story is very unlikely. As well, I mentioned a few different people with different names for accomplices over the years, and the police went to check all them out whenever he mentions a name, and they all check out and none of them were with him. So he just spins a lot of different stories. Now, another account, which was with Marvin Scott. Now, Marvin Scott's interesting because he spoke quite a lot through correspondence with Junior, through letters, and he's been told a lot of different things. He has a lot of different stories. As well, Marvin Scott also spent time in the house, and he was there with the Warrens along with other paranormal investigators. So we're going to talk about him in a few different sections in this video. To start, we're going to talk about the correspondence, but we'll get to what happened to him with the Warrens a little bit later in the video. Okay, so Marvin Scott, the author of As I Saw It, A Reporter's Intrepid Journey, wrote with Junior in many letters while was in jail. The letters Scott received also had different confessions. At the beginning, he told Scott that he was high on weed in the basement and heard nothing happening. Then another account that he gave Scott was the whole thing of him arguing with his sister, and she's the one who started the whole thing, and that he shot her by accident while trying to get the gun away. Then another confession that he gave Scott was that he heard voices telling him to take out everyone. Now, there are two really important quotes in the correspondences with Scott that we're going to look over here. The first quote: "There was no insanity, only people talking to Weber, the lawyer, about books, movies, and about me being possessed." Now, the second important quote is, "There was no demon. You know who the demon is. I am the demon." Which, that last quote is really what a lot of people have taken of him finally telling the truth. But, he changes his story again after he says that. As for Marvin Scott's paranormal investigation that he did with the Warners, we're going to get into that a little bit later in the video, so do stick around if you want to hear about what happened to him inside the house. So the family and what happened to them is really the basis for why they say that the house is haunted. But who originally said the house was haunted? Well, it would have been the family who moved in after what happened, and that is the Lutz family. And we're going to discuss them in this next section. In December 1975, George and Kathy Lutz and their 3 children and dog, Harry, moved into the Amityville Horror House. After 28 days, the Lutzes fled the house, claiming to have been terrorized by paranormal phenomena. So let's delve into the Lutz family and all the controversies surrounding their story of the haunting. It was in the 1970s when George and Kathy met and they got married. Kathy was a divorcee with 3 children. George decided that they need to find a bigger house for the family, so they began looking at homes. In 1975, the Lutz family found a 5-bedroom home in Amityville on the South Shore of Long Island, New York. The house was priced very low, selling for $80,000. Interestingly, in New York, there are no laws that require a realtor to disclose any sort of death in a home to new buyers. That being said, though, the realtor did tell them what happened. I think it was a pretty big story back then, so they kind of heard about it. And the DeFeo family, what happened to them was only a year prior to them looking at this house. So I'm sure the Lutz family already kind of heard about all this. I did find it interesting that realtors in New York, even to this day, don't have to disclose that. So that's interesting because it is required where I live anyway. But I'm in Canada, so I think I'd want to know if someone passed away in the house before I moved into it. So despite knowing of the George and Kathy moved forward with the purchase as the deal was just too good to walk away from. They moved in by December of that year, and soon after moving in, the family started to report some of the following paranormal events. I'm just doing a quick list here. There's a lot of different stories. There's a lot of detailed stories that are in the book, and a lot of those stories have been scrutinized quite a bit, but I'm just going to do a general list of some of the things that they reported happened to them. There's a lot, but we'll just condense it down to a few. So some of the things that they experienced: strange odors, green slime oozing out of the walls and keyholes, cold spots. In fact, it was said that the house never actually warmed up, and George was constantly cutting wood up to try to get the house to warm up. However, this was December, so. A nearby garage door opening and closing as well. An invisible spirit knocking a knife down in the kitchen. They also reported a pig-like creature with red eyes staring down at George and his son Daniel from a window. Additionally, and this is a controversial topic, a priest came to bless the house and heard a voice scream, "Get out." He told the Lutzes never to sleep in that particular room in the house. Now, this priest, his story changed 3 different times, and we're going to go into more detail about this priest coming up, so stick around for that. There's a lot of controversy surrounding this priest and the things that he would say. Now, last on the list is what happened on their last night there, and this apparently is the reason why they all fled and just left everything behind. George claimed that he would wake up almost every night at 3:15 a.m., which was around the time DeFeo took out his family. On the last night there, George claims that he heard the kids' beds slamming up and down on the floor, but he was stuck laying helpless in his own bed, being held down by some sort of unseen force or unseen thing. Later that night, he then saw Kathy left levitating from the bed. So that morning, he packed up the whole family and they abandoned the house. They didn't empty the fridge, closets, nothing. They just left everything behind. George has said that a feeling came over him later after they left, and he said that he felt something horrible would have happened if the family stayed there. So was it real? Let's go over some of the things that did and did not happen. Some of the things that made believers out of people, but then some of the things that turned those people into non-believers after. And let's also discuss the motives for why someone would lie and make up a hoax like this. It all begins with the book. The book, The Amityville Horror, is written by an American author, Jay Anson, published in September 1977. It is also the basis for all the movies that were released from 1979 and on. There's been so many sequels and movies. The book is written based on the claims of the paranormal experiences by the Lutz family, but has led to much controversy and lawsuits over the truthfulness. Anson wrote the book based on 35-hour recorded interviews of the accounts of George and Kathy Lutz. So let's talk about how the book came to be, how it got its start. So remember William Weber, the lawyer who I said to remember? The lawyer of DeFeo Jr. He was trying to get a book published about his client's crimes. George actually heard about this, so George reached out to Weber. Weber met up with George and Kathy, and to quote from People magazine, Weber said, "I know this book is a hoax. We created this horror story over many bottles of wine." This meeting is where they discussed the outline of what would become Anson's book. Additionally, Weber apparently fed details about the DeFeos that only Weber knew, and he shared those details with the Lutz family so they could incorporate them into the story. Weber told them about a neighbor's cat that would peer into the DeFeo's window at night, and that turned into the red-eyed pig story. He also told them how the father, Ronald DeFeo, had once smacked the mother while she held a plate of red sauce spaghetti. That became the mysterious red goo on the wall that morphed into green slime and bubbling from keyholes. On a TV show called A Current Affair, Weber was also quoted as saying, "We took real-life incidents and transposed them." In other words, it was a hoax. Weber gave them information that would make their story more believable, and that's kind of what they all invented over this bottle of wine. So why was Weber outing everyone? Well, before a book was even ever written or published, Weber and the Lutz's relationship began to fall apart over money. They had a fight over how the money from the book deal would be split. The Lutzes took their story to Jay Anson. Anson was known for making a short documentary regarding the making of The Exorcist. So that's why they reached out to him and they asked him to write it instead. So they pretty much cut Weber out of the deal. And that's why Weber started coming forward. Now with that, some people are saying, oh, well, Weber's lying because he's upset that he didn't get money from the deal. But a lot of other people are like, well, you know, this sounds like he's probably telling the truth. So like some people are on the fence about it. All depends, I guess, on what your opinion of the situation is. In 2016, there was an article in Skeptic magazine, and it had to do with the 40th anniversary of the Amityville Horror House. This was written by skeptic Robert Bartholomew. This was relating to Anson's character. Robert said, "The best way to describe Jay Anson is he is a writer who didn't let the facts get in the way of a good story." So essentially he's saying like Jay Anson likes to embellish the story to make it good, just like how Hollywood tends to embellish stories as well when they do true crime or true story movies, right? Kind of just like shows maybe why also that George sought out Anson, because he figured that he would make a good story out of it that would end up leading to something. Now, what's interesting is Anson doesn't really need to defend himself too much when it comes to the book because he just wrote it based on the accounts of the Lutz family. A Writer's Digest interview in 1979, Anson is quoted as saying, "It's funny, almost nobody ever says to me, hey, that book of yours is a bunch of bull. I don't believe a word of it. Instead, they ask if I think what the Lutzes told me is true. And I answer them the same way I answer when you ask. I tell them that I have no idea whether the book is true or not, but I'm sure that the Lutzes believe what they told me to be true." So Anson pretty much admits that, yeah, he's writing the story based on what someone else told him. And he doesn't fact check it or whatever. How do you really fact check a haunting anyway? So Anson just kind of admits to, embellishing things and making the story better because he's a writer. And no one really seems to have a problem with that. The issue really surrounds more about what the Lutzes did. Now, in a bold move to further prove that they were telling the truth, George and Kathy Lutz actually decided to take a lie detector test. So in 1979 June, they took this polygraph test about the house. The tests were performed by Chris Gugas and Michael Rice, who apparently were among the top 5 polygraph experts in America at the time. And they said that the results did not indicate that George and Kathy were lying. So essentially, they passed the lie detector test. Now, just an important note, I didn't really know exactly where in the video to put this, but this book is another story that further perpetuates the whole like Aboriginal burial ground, Aboriginal related thing as to why something is haunted. So I just want to point out that the claim in the book that relates back to an Aboriginal site was refuted. And, I think it's important to kind of point this stuff out because it's a little bit been overdone and been pushed too much on the Aboriginal people to blame for a lot of these hauntings. And a lot of it came out of these books in Hollywood. So the local Shinnecock Aboriginals rejected the claim made in Chapter 11 of the book. In Chapter 11 of the book, it claimed that the house was built on a site where the tribe had once abandoned the mentally ill and the dying. First of all, it's a really weird statement because normally the tribes aren't known for just abandoning people like that in their tribe, but they refuted that claim in Chapter 11. In 1977, George and Kathy Lutz filed a lawsuit against William Weber, along with some other investigators and press outlets who were all pretty much claiming that this was all just a big hoax. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed as just frivolous, and the judge at the time, I think, even gave a little bit of a talk to Weber as a lawyer being involved in the middle of all this drama, too. The judge wasn't very impressed about that. All right, the next controversy, remember the priest? I told you that we would come back to him. Well, here we are. The role of Father, I'm going to butcher this name even though I looked up how to say it, Pikararu, apologies, aka Father Mancuso in the book. This priest was widely spoken about. During the lawsuit, the father stated in an affidavit that his only contact with the Lutzes concerning the matter had been by telephone. Other accounts, he told people that he visited the home but experienced nothing unusual. However, later in 1979 on a TV show called In Search Of, he confirms that he went there to bless the home, and he says he was slapped by an invisible force who told him to get out. And this was the original story that was said about the father. So there's a lot of flip-flopping here by the priest. A lot of this, like people changing their stories around, things like that, is what people hang on to as well and trying to say that that's supernatural. There's a reason that they keep changing it. However, he is a priest, and that being said, this was at the time when like The Exorcist came out and things like that, and the church was kind of really trying to distance themselves away from exorcisms and things of that nature. So it could be possible that he changed his story because he's being pressured by the church, but he could have also changed his story because he wanted to be like this, up and coming priest who was doing this stuff. It's kind of iffy to say, but there's a lot of politics involved in the church. Even nowadays, to get the church to even look at an exorcism is like nearly impossible. They don't even really do them anymore. Like it's really rare. They've really tried to distance themselves away from exorcisms because there's been a lot of deaths and a lot of dangerous stuff that's happened in the past. So they really try to back away from that nowadays. All right, speaking of circling back, we're also gonna circle back to Scott. I'm just gonna begin this section with a quote from George Lutz. In 1979, George Lutz told the Washington Post, "Our critics are people who've never been to the house, just people who read a book. No one who was ever in the house who investigated it ever called it a hoax. No one with any credentials who was personally involved ever called it a hoax. No one who helped us there with the auction, with getting stuff to the Salvation Army ever called it a hoax. All I know is what happened to me." So he swears that if you go into the house, you wouldn't call it a hoax. You'd experience something. So Marvin Scott, who is in correspondence with DeFeo this whole time, he's that writer that we mentioned from before who got 4 different confessions. So he decided to spend a night in the house, and he did that with the Warrens. There were other paranormal investigators and other psychics there, but the Warrens were also there. And, they were a big, famous couple for paranormal investigations. And they came up in, I think, our previous video, or no, I think the video before, about ghost hunting, investigation tools, and history of ghost hunting. And then they're coming up again here. And I did run a poll briefly on the community tab about them. If you do want to learn more about them, there's stories about them. And the stuff, it's not a good story. And people who love the Warrens probably don't want to hear this stuff. If you're interested on me doing a video on the Warrens where I kind of dive into all the stuff that people tend to just not talk about or ignore, let me know below and I'll work on that video too. All right, let's get back to Marvin Scott. In 1976, Scott spent a night in the home with paranormal investigators, psychics, and, the Warrens. Now, Scott said the most chilling event of the night was just the incantations that the psychics were doing. So like, that's the only thing that really kind of like spooked him, or like not really spooked him, but just like was chilling, was, you know, paranormal or supernatural feeling to him, was just their incantations. Otherwise, he says he experienced nothing else. There were no lights flickering. There were no cold spots. He didn't feel uneasy at any time. He didn't feel scared. It just felt like a plain old house to him. There's also the infamous sewing room that was in the book too. That was like really dangerous room to be in. His story about that room, he sat in that room with Lorraine, just him and Lorraine. He felt nothing and nothing was going on, but Lorraine turned to him and said, and I quote, "Marvin, this is the closest to hell I ever want to get." And I believe that quote was used in the movies, in the Conjuring movies, I think. I'm pretty sure it was used in one of the movies. But Scott had no clue, like, really what she was feeling, because he was feeling nothing. Nothing was happening. So he was just kind of like, okay, like, you know, how do you respond to that? Personally, based on things like I've learned about the Warrens, I think she just said that to him because he was a writer who was writing books, he was writing articles, and he was in touch with DeFeo Jr. as well for some time. So like, I think she just said it to kind of ham up the whole situation for the writer that was in the room. If you want to read more about Scott's experiences with the DeFeo case and the haunting of Amityville House, I suggest that you go check out his book. It's called As I Saw It, A Reporter's Intrepid Journey. So if you're interested, go check that out. Lastly, I just want to mention another event that happened. It was two investigators pretty much went through and just did some general research and fact checking to check some of the incidents that happened in the book to see if they even were real. So I'm just going to go over what they found as an example of just people doing cursory research and fact checking. So two researchers, Rick Moran and Peter Jordan, they just did their simple fact checking to debunk a couple events in the book. In the book, apparently, there was a scene where hoof prints were showing up in the snow on January 1st, 1976. Rick and Peter confirmed the weather records, and there was no snow on the ground at that time. Also, they were checking with the neighbors who said that they never heard anything, they never experienced anything, saw anything unusual with that house, and nothing unusual when the family was living there. They didn't hear screaming, they didn't hear banging, nothing. Everything seemed normal. Also, the book mentions a bar called the Witch's Brew, but there was no bar in Amityville with that name at the time. Lastly, the book talks about the Lutzes calling the police, and they did some research and checked that. No calls were made to the house during that time that the Lutzes were living there. Remember, the Lutzes were only living there for 28 days, so it's pretty easy to fact check a lot of stuff because like you're talking about a 28-day period. So that was just two researchers back then who just did a bit of fact checking to kind of disprove a number of the stories. And there are other people who've done more fact checking and more like disproving and stuff. So you can only imagine, like, if two guys could kind of do that and disprove like 4 different stories in the book, there's more stuff over time that has come up as questionable. So, is the home really haunted? Well, another way that we could find out if the home's haunted is by asking the people who moved in after the Lutz. There's been multiple families that have lived there since the Lutz and what happened to them. Coming up a little bit later in this video, we're going to talk about other families' experiences in the house. But before we get to that, let's talk about the motives of why the Lutzes may have lied. So if this was all a hoax and this was all lies, then we have to ask ourselves why. Like, what's the motive? What reason do they have to lie? And why take on the risk of, leaving 28 days into buying a new house, leaving yourself in a weird financial position as well? If something paranormal didn't happen, you're kind of taking a big risk here, hoping that your lie pays out. So let's talk a little bit about the issues that the Lutzes were facing at the time and some of the reasons why people think that they may have been lying. So George and Kathy Lutz apparently were dealing with huge legal and financial troubles at the time of the hauntings. There's one theory that people have that George actually intentionally bought the house and moved into the Amityville house with the plan of creating an outlandish story to sell. That's why George reached out to his lawyer, because he knew that the lawyer was actually looking for someone to write a book. And when the lawyer and the conversation with the lawyer and the fight happened with money, George also had an author ready to go that he picked out that worked on the exorcism documentary. So it kind of seemed like George had like this really planned out, like he knew who to reach out to and he knew who to talk to pretty quickly on. So it kind of seemed very calculated, which is why some people theorize that they may have bought the house on purpose as a way to make money to get themselves out of the hole that they were in. Now, you could call that a conspiracy theory, so let's just go with like Occam's razor, like the most obvious thing, and that is that they were having trouble paying the mortgage and paying the taxes, and that's what most people say was the issue with them. They moved in there, they overspent, they didn't have the money to afford everything. So some people believe that they left the house and they were either going to make their money off selling the story, or they were going to somehow try to sue the people who sold them the house in some way, even though that they knew about the what happened in the house beforehand. And in New York, you don't even have to disclose it anyway. So those are two of the thoughts processes behind what people think why this happened. So the Lutzes reportedly made about $300,000 off the book alone, and I'm sure they had deals as well with the movies too. So they did make a fair amount of money off of this. So the Lutzes moved out and new people moved in. Let's talk about them now. Since the Lutzes moved out of the home, every family that has lived there after has never experienced a paranormal event or anything of that nature. But they have experienced a lot of harassment, lots of situations that they've been in because of how famous the house is. Pretty much their home became like a disaster to live in. The first owners after the Lutz, Jim and Barbara Cromartie, bought 112 Ocean Avenue, the Amityville Horror House, in February 1977 for $55,000. The fact that it sold for $55,000 and the family bought it originally for $80,000 also leads some people to think, oh, there was some money troubles there because they ended up selling the house for less than what they even bought it for. So when Jim and Barbara bought the house, they were unaware that a book would soon be published about it. So they weren't actually disclosed about the book, which they probably could have done a lawsuit of some sort for them with it. I would imagine they probably would have gotten something from the lawsuit with that. But I don't think they ever really approached a lawsuit about it. From what I found anyways online, I didn't see anything about them suing. But so the book was released and then their home just became a horrible place to be living in. By November, so they moved in February. So by November, Jim and Barbara's home had been bombarded by so many unwanted visitors that they ended up changing the address to 108. So 112 Ocean Avenue is actually 108 now. In an interview with Newsday, Jim and Barbara revealed just how bad it was living inside the house because of the media attention. They barely slept. Visitors would come very late at night, probably the 3 a.m. mark because of the whole story that the Lutz family told and what DeFeo Jr. did at 3 a.m. The lawn was littered with beer cans and cigarettes and other trash. Someone once even left human excrement on their porch. They had their outdoor Christmas decorations, I think, were all stolen. They had like other outdoor things that were stolen as well. Their daughter was harassed at school all the time for living in the haunted house. So like that was pretty hard on her as well. And they attempted to sell the house, but nobody wanted to buy it. It was just like, no one wants it. Whether people thought it was actually haunted and didn't want it, or whether people just didn't want all the visitors and unwanted guests. Like they didn't want to live in that environment. So either way, the house was just a mess and like unable to be sold. So what did they decide to do? In an effort to try to get people to leave them alone, but also I think it's a little bit of a petty revenge kind of situation. And Jim and Barbara gave up on trying to sell the house and they began taking speaking engagements. So if someone invited them to a TV show or like a conference or something like that to be interviewed about what it's like living inside the house, they would go and they would tell the truth, which was there's nothing in the house. There's no hauntings. There's nothing supernatural going on inside the house. So they're pretty much traveling the states, like debunking the whole house. And that was, I don't know if you want to call it petty revenge or just to get people to leave them alone. Either way. So they actually lived in that home for 10 years before the hype of the whole story finally died down and they were able to sell the house. So the next people to buy the house after them were the O'Neills, and the O'Neills purchased the home for $325,000. So the O'Neills actually swapped out the iconic windows as well to try to get rid of a lot of the tourists and looky-loos. They also filled in the in-ground pool. They tried to change like some of the exterior so that people wouldn't be showing up to the house all the time. The unfortunate thing with the O'Neills is when they bought the house, the hype was died down and there wasn't like people showing up on the lawn. There wasn't like all this drama around it. But shortly after they moved in, the movie was broadcasted on TV. And this would have been like the 80s or whatever. So everyone like saw the movie and everyone's like picking up the TV channels, you know. It's not like nowadays where, you know, you can just get stuff on demand and all that. So the movie showed up on the TV. There was like a rerun of it. And then it got people all worked up about the house again. And they started seeking out the house. So the O'Neills, unfortunately, unfortunately had to deal with some more of this tourism stuff, which is why they kind of switched out the windows and filled in the pool. They actually fixed up the boathouse too. They tried to change a lot of the stuff so people would stop showing up and taking pictures and doing whatever else they were doing there. So in 2010, in September, the O'Neills sold the house. And they sold it to Caroline and David D'Antonio. And they sold it for $950,000. The D'Antonios lived there for about 6 years. And then they put the house on the market for $850,000. In 2017, the house was sold to an undisclosed buyer, and it was sold for $605,000, which is like $200,000 less than the D'Antonios were asking. And today the house is for sale again, but it has been completely remodeled and redesigned, and it's up for a huge price, up for about $1.7 million. So huge jumps. Just looking at these numbers in general shows you kind of the economy and the real estate and how crazy high it's jumped up from. Now, that being said, that's the history of the owners since the Lutz's family, and not a single one of these families have reported any paranormal incident happened in the house. Okay, so we talked about all the owners that came after the Lutz, but what about the children that were living in the house during the haunting? That's what we're going to talk about coming up now. Now, out of all the children who experienced the haunting and the events, only 2 of them are actually publicly speaking about it. The rest of them have all wanted to keep their privacy and be left alone, which is fair. Now, the 2 children that are all grown up now are Christopher Coratino and Danny Lutz. Let's talk about what they have to say. We'll start with Christopher. Christopher was 7 when he was moved into the home with the rest of his family. Christopher is now around 48, 49 years old, and he maintains that the hauntings were not a hoax. Christopher insists that the hauntings were happening, but he believes that it was the fault of George, the stepdad. So Christopher says that apparently George was dabbling in the occult, performing magic, seances, and different things, trying to call things from the other side. He's quoted as saying that George was extremely curious of everything paranormal. Christopher says that although the haunting was real, much of it was over-exaggerated. As he says in an NBC interview in 2005, George is a professional showman, in my opinion. I just feel as though we were being exploited. So Christopher, he does insist that they had paranormal experiences in the home. He says one time he saw a presence, quote, as definite as a shadow in the shape of a man that moved towards him and then dissipated. What's interesting is George actually tried to sue Christopher in 2003 over allegations of trademark infringement. And essentially, Christopher was causing trouble with a new Amityville movie. It's been a drama back then. There was a movie being made, and it was titled The Children's Diaries, but there was no diaries, and they never actually got permission from the children or paid them for their likeness or anything. So George was making money off of it, I guess, but the kids weren't profiting, even though it was supposed to be about them. So there's been a drama around that. If you're interested, look it up. Christopher was doing a lot of like troll kind of things to mess up this movie during that time too. But George, he actually died in 2006, so I don't think the lawsuit went anywhere because George died pretty soon after. Now, Christopher is quoted as saying the following: George points his finger at the house and says there's something evil there, but the finger should be pointed at what George had done. It should be pointed at him, George. He's a perpetrator and an instigator. Now, what about Danny Lutz, the other son who's talking publicly about this? Danny actually seems to be very traumatized by a lot of things that happened, it seems. He released a documentary movie that he was working on with some people, and it's called My Amityville Horror. All right, so Danny was 10 when he moved into the home versus his brother who was 7. So that would make him now, I believe, around 52 or 53. So over the years, he has insisted that everything is true. And he goes into great detail in this documentary that he made, but unfortunately I couldn't watch the whole thing. Now, a couple important things to point out in this documentary that I did see some clips of and I read a bit about. And I think these are 2 important things that can maybe help you understand his mindset, or maybe give you an idea of what's going on or what happened to them that might be able to kind of shape what you feel about the house. All right, so first off, Danny admitted that George was extremely controlling and both physically and verbally as a stepfather. There were experts in the documentary who were suspecting that the horrors Danny experienced may have all been a way that he processed George was tormenting the children. Danny got very mad at the suggestion that this could all be psychological. The documentary also shows Danny refusing to do a polygraph test like his parents did, and he got very angry about that as well. Now, regarding the paranormal activity in the house, Danny says that furniture would move around and he would hear voices. And that one time his body was actually possessed by a spirit of some sort, or a demon, I guess. So out of all the children, only 2 of them are speaking publicly about what happened, and they're both saying that the hauntings happened, except one of them says some of it happened and the rest was highly embellished. Then the other says that everything that's in the book happened, but we kind of know that not everything happened because of some of the stories that we heard from other people. I find it interesting though that the kids do think that the place was haunted, but they were also very young too, so that could have shaped their viewpoint on stuff that maybe it wasn't really happening. But let's get into the conclusion and summary, because I want to discuss with you guys my theories on what I maybe think happened, or at least have a few different theories that I have on things that could happen. And I want to hear your guys' opinion on it as well. What do you think happened? So let's get into that. All right, so is the Amityville house actually haunted? After this deep dive into the history of it and understanding the story, I see 3 possible answers to this question. Number 1, yes, it was haunted. Number 2, it all was a hoax. Or number 3, George himself was haunted. So my personal opinion on this, if it wasn't for the grown kids' accounts coming out and then like saying that the place was haunted, I would just immediately say, oh yeah, it's a hoax. It sounds like it all was a hoax. But between the kids saying, yeah, the place was actually haunted, and then the lie detector tests that were passed by the parents, but then also the mention of how George was dabbling in the occult, I personally think that George was haunted, that he opened up some stuff or he maybe had an attachment, and what happened to the family was all related to George. And that's why all the families that lived in the house after never experienced anything, because it's following George around. It's not inside that house. I'm also starting to think that maybe George did these seances and all these other things on purpose, knowing the history of that house. He was trying to get something to come out and trying to make something happen. And all he ended up doing was kind of getting himself haunted or whatever it may be. So he was kind of like the maker of his own demise there. Now, there's also the possibility, too, that George maybe was doing some stuff to the family or the kids, moving some stuff around, fishing wire, whatever. They were young. Maybe he convinced them of events that were happening that weren't actually there happening. But as a kid, you know, magicians can fool, and maybe he did something like that. That's a possibility, too. But one of the big things that's kind of sad when you watch some of the clips from Danny's documentary is there's trauma there, and you can see it. Like, he's very upset still, even as an adult. And there is a chance that a lot of this is just memories of things that George did to them that they've somehow transposed into this haunting. It's kind of hard to say for sure, but I think it is important not to completely dismiss that it could be trauma related, trauma response related, whatever it may be. But I do hope that the boys end up getting some help. Christopher seems to be more level-headed, and Danny seemed kind of needs more help. But let me know, what do you guys think? What do you guys think about the house? Do you think it's true? Do you think it's a hoax? Do you think maybe George was haunted? Do you think it's maybe just some sort of way that the kids process trauma? Like, let me know what you think. Also, speaking of hoaxes, if you enjoyed this video, you should go check out last week's video where I discussed the history of seances, and there's actually a lot of discussion about hoaxes and things like that in that video. So if you find this kind of stuff interesting, definitely go check it out. I will link it up here for you guys to check out. But as for the rest of this video, if you enjoyed it, hit like, don't forget to subscribe on your way out, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next one.